Okay, what I'm going to try to quickly do here is to run through one of the activities that I had planned to do with you last Saturday at the second Research Methodologies Day School. And what I was hoping to do was to try to model some of the ways that you might use the literature around your methodology in your methodology section. So remember, you need to write a section that explains what methodology you've chosen and why. And that section should be informed by the reading that you've done around your methodology. And so you'll want perhaps to bring in quotations from people who've written about your chosen methodology and explain how that relates to what you've done. And so that's the purpose of this quick slideshow, is to kind of try to run through that with you to some extent. And so what I was planning to do, and perhaps what we could do at a distance now, you could kind of pause the video at particular points when I ask a question and have a go at the activity. But as I say, I'm going to run through it relatively quickly. So the first thing you need to do is to think of something that you might be going to research. So of course you've now got your research questions in place for the most part. But imagine that you're kind of starting from scratch and that you're going to do some research into a fight that you've seen, and it might be one that you've seen at school or in a playground, or it might be on a night out in town, or it could be any number of different fights. It could be a physical fight, it could be an altercation between people. So just, maybe pause the video, think of a fight that you could do some investigation into. And then what I was proposing was to get you to think about that fight and imagine that you've got access to the witnesses of the fight and possibly various other possible sources of information. So what are you going to do to gather evidence? How could you get information about this fight? And you could think in the most lateral terms about that. So of course, if you've got some witnesses, maybe they're the prime source of data, so you could interview them or have a focus group with them or send them a questionnaire. But think more broadly than that. Where else could you get data from? So you could perhaps see whether there was any CCTV footage. You could try to find out if it was reported in the local press and what was said about it there. You could try to find out if there was some kind of official record of the fight. If it was in a school, is there something logged in the school's records about it? Has there been a police report about it? So you could start to think about the different sources of data. You could even talk to the participants themselves. Now, let's imagine that at this stage then, when you've thought about all the different sources of data, you've chosen case study as a methodology. And what this image is trying to convey is that a case, when you do a case study on a single case, you'll always need to think of it as part of the larger jigsaw. So imagine it was like a medical case, so a case of gallstones, let's say. So it's only one case of gallstones, and it might have particular features to do with it that are related to diet. So in this particular individual, this particular case, then diet is at the root cause of the illness. But in another instance, you might have somebody who has perfectly healthy diet and it's some genetic predisposition to that. So there's a bigger picture beyond the individual case that you need to be cognizant of when you do a case study. So it's all part of a kind of gigantic jigsaw puzzle, and you're just trying to find out about a single one in detail. So the basis of case study is this deep interest in individual cases as they might relate to a larger whole. And you can ask yourself questions like, is the case typical? Is it a novel case? Is it a deviant or an extreme or a contrasting case? So what kind of case do you think it might be? So thinking of your example of a fight, is this typical of what you would see in that particular context? Is it really unusual? Is it particularly serious? So are there novel features associated with it? So one of the first things to do when you do a case study is to try to think about, what kind of case is this? How representative is it of what the other pieces of the jigsaw puzzle might be like? And in that way, you're kind of relating it to that bigger picture that you're trying to shed light on through looking at a single little piece of it. So we've asked, what kind of case is it? Now, what we're going to do now, given that you've thought about the possible sources of data, that you've thought about what kind of case it might be, we're now going to turn to the literature on case study to help us write about that methodology. So you've got to write briefly about the methodology on your poster, and you've got to write about it in a bit more detail in your report, and perhaps fill it out again and do it more fully as part of your major study. So what I'm going to use here is an analogy that I've used in class a number of times now, which is that of a dinner party. So that what you're thinking about is which voices are you going to invite to sit round the table in your methodology section, and what's your position in relation to them. So it's as if you are the host of the party and you're inviting particular people to come. And so what that means, if you kind of play out the metaphor, is that you're interested in what they might say to each other. Do they agree with one another? Do they oppose one another? And also, you're really interested in taking part in the conversation. So what's your opinion of what they've got to say, and how are you going to use that to shed light on what you've done? So let's take an example then. So here's our dinner party, and we're going to invite our first guest, who is Bill Gillam. So there he is, Bill Gillam, joining the table. And what's he bringing? Well, he's bringing the idea from an earlier theorist called Clifford Geertz. And he says that Geertz emphasizes the importance of beginning research into any culture by describing what you find in some detail. He calls this thick description, a process which makes you pay attention to the fine grain of what you are observing and reflecting on it. We're now getting to the central concern of the case study method, the collection and study of multiple forms of evidence in sufficient detail to achieve understanding. So what are the key things that Bill Gillam is saying here about Geertz's approach? He's saying that you need thick description. He's saying that you need fine grain detail of what's going on, and that you've got to reflect carefully on that fine grain detail, and that you need multiple forms of evidence to give you that level of detail. So thinking back to what we said earlier about where could you get the information from, that kind of helps, does it not? So would you alter your approach to researching your fight in light of what Gillam just said? Well, perhaps you might decide that observation of CCTV footage was really important here, because what you could try to look at is the fine-grained detail of the body language of the participants in the run-up to the fight and the behaviour of the crowd during the fight. So as well as talking to people who witnessed it and actually trying to find out as much as you can from them after the fact, you might try to also find out detail, if at all possible, by looking at how that actual event unfolded. Moreover, you might want in your interviews with people to observe their body language. So do they look uncomfortable at particular points? Do they look down at the floor? Do they laugh? Do they look distressed? And that's kind of, or do they wink at you at some point? And that's the kind of fine-grained detail that case study is asking you to look at. And of course, you can only do a certain amount within the scope of what is a relatively small-scale research project, but some observation of the fine-grained detail is really useful in illustrating that you've understood that that's a feature of the case study method. And what you could do in your methodology section is use a quote like that from Gillam and then say how that's informed your choice of method. So you might say, I'm doing interviews, but because this is a case study, as well as listening to what people say, I'm also observing their behaviours and their body language during the interview. And that shows that you're familiar with that aspect of case study and that you're using it to inform your method. So this is the sort of thing that you could do regardless of your choice of methodology. We're using case study as an example, but you can do similar things with the literature around any of the methodologies that you've chosen. So what I'm trying to prompt you to do is think about how you could describe Gillam's influence on you in your methodology section. Let's move on then and introduce another guest. So we'd heard about Geertz, and here's Geertz joining the party. You'll note that it's 1973, so this is relatively early in the history of case study. He's one of the founding fathers of that particular approach. And you can see here the roots of what Willem is saying, because Geertz says it's not enough to describe a wink and label it as behaviour. Rather, the thing to ask about human behaviours is what their import is and what manner of men are these. So a wink can mean a very different thing in different contexts when used by different people. So body language is notoriously variable across the globe. For example, if you look at different cultures, they'll use different gestures for different reasons. And so one of the key questions for you, if you're looking at these kinds of fine-grained detail, is what does that, can you speculate on what does that particular set of behaviours actually mean in this context? And you might even pursue it by asking about it. So that's something else which perhaps could inform your methodology section, and you could use a quote from Geertz in order to do that and say, this is what Geertz says. What that means is that when I observe particular behaviours in my interview, I'm deeply concerned with what they actually mean in that context. And part of my major study might be to pursue what those behaviours signify in this group of people in this situation. And again, you could try, as I've just done there out loud, to write a sentence or two that explains that to go into your methodology section. And can you see here how what we're trying to do is to build up a dialogue between the literature and you, and demonstrate that you're familiar with that literature, but more importantly, that you can use it in planning exactly what it is you're going to do. So let's bring another voice, a third voice here, Robert Yin. Got him in a beautiful frock there. So that's 2003. And he says that case study is empirical inquiry to investigate a contemporary phenomenon in a real-life context, especially when the boundaries between the phenomenon and the context are not clearly evident. Now, that's quite a mouthful. So empirical inquiry just means that you're looking for evidence. Empirical means evidence-based. So it's an evidence-based investigation that looks at a contemporary phenomenon. That just means something that's happening now. So that's in a real-life context. And he's saying that it's especially useful when the boundaries between the phenomenon and the context are not clearly evident. So let's look at our example of a fight. So the fight is the thing that's happening now, the contemporary phenomenon. And the context is the playground. So it's the physical space. It's also the social space, the school, the community in which they live. So we have a set of onlookers here. And you might imagine, well, they're part of the context for this fight, aren't they? But to some extent, would the fight be unfolding as it is without that audience? Is there something about status and about these boys wanting to establish a leading role in that group of young boys? So to what extent is the audience context for the fight or actually part of the fight? And this is what Yin is saying. Where does one end and the other begin? So he's saying that case study is particularly useful when you're looking at something that's unfolding and when it's kind of deeply ingrained with its context, and the context influences it and it influences the context. So again, useful question at this point. Is Yin's idea useful to you in the writing of your methodology section and in the way that you're going to conduct your study? Will it inform your approach, and how? So a deep interest in the context for the study and the way in which your phenomenon is entangled with that context can also be part of what you do. And so in your methodology section, you might want to say that you are concerned with finding out as much detail as possible about the context for your study, and you're also interested in the ways that that context is actually part of and bleeds into the phenomenon that you're looking at itself. So that would sound great, wouldn't it, in a methodology section that you'd quote from Yin, and then you'd make that point about looking at the context. So again, hopefully you can begin to see how this sort of approach can build up. So let's go a little further. Here we've got Robert Stake, and he says that there are three main types of case study. There's an intrinsic, instrumental, and a multiple case study. Excuse me. So let's see what he means by that. Well, intrinsic means this particular case, this little bit of the jigsaw puzzle is fascinating. It's really interesting. I'm going to find out everything I can about this case. And so it's a kind of microscope approach to looking at something in detail in and of itself and for its own sake. A multiple case study is rather different because it looks at different cases to see what you can find out by comparing them. And then the instrumental case study is saying, well, this case might be a useful way to find out more about a bigger thing that I'm interested in. So just taking this a little bit further, let's apply it to our case study into a fight. So an intrinsic case study would say that fight was absolutely fascinating. I wonder exactly what went down there. How did that unfold? And I'm going to focus right in on it as an individual intrinsic case. An instrumental case study would say, I'm really interested in boys' values and behaviours in this school, and I wonder what that fight can tell us about that bigger question. So you're doing a case study as an instrumental approach to finding out something bigger about the school and about the boys who go there. And then a multiple case study would be, well, I think what I'm going to do is compare that fight that happened in our playground with one that's been documented at a public school like Eton or Harrow and see how they compare with each other. Do they unfold in similar ways? A boy's values and behaviours the same here as they are in a very different school with a very different culture and a different social background. So that would be a multiple case study. And again, you could use that in your methodology section because you could say, my case study of a fight is an instrumental one. And you could quote from Stake in defining exactly what you mean by that, and then talk briefly about the bigger issue that you are concerned with and interested in. And this ties in really nicely, does it not, with what Yin said about context, because the context is going to be the focus of interest of your instrumental study. So you're trying to use the case study as a way of finding out more about that context. So those two voices kind of talk to each other across the table, don't they? And that's, again, something that you could try and capture and include in your methodology section. So we're building it up now. We've got just a couple more voices to bring in. Here's Lawrence Stenhouse writing in 1999. And he said, the task of case study is to produce a report of experience and to offer evidence, not to deal with generalization. So it's an interesting voice to bring in at this point, because we could ask ourselves, well, what's Stenhouse on one side of the table saying to Stake about instrumental case studies on the other side of the table? So remember, Stenhouse is saying that this is about evidence, not generalization, whereas Stake is saying, well, that case might be a useful way to find out something about a bigger thing that I'm interested in. So is Stake arguing for generalization? Well, not really when you think about it, because what Stenhouse is saying is that you can't look at a single case and then say that every single other case is identical to that. So going back to our example of gallstones from the start, just because diet has caused it in one case doesn't mean that it's caused it in every case. And so he's saying that the whole point of a case study is not to generalize and to say that all cases are the same. However, what Stake is saying is that, well, okay, we can't maybe generalize, but what we can do is to use that case as indicative of bigger issues that surround it. So he's relating it to its particular context. He's not seeking to generalize from it across all sorts of other cases. For example, the fight at Eton. He's not saying that our fight would be the same as the fight at Eton. He's saying that our fight might be an interesting way to explore boys' values and behaviours in this particular school. And so when you come to start to draw your conclusions about some of your questions or speculate on your conclusions, then some of your conclusions might relate to that bigger context, but they won't, importantly, relate to trying to generalize from your single case to every other case that might occur in different contexts. And again, yin might be brought in here because, of course, yin is saying that the boundary between the case and its context is blurred and they're inextricably linked. And that's one of the reasons why you can't generalize from a single case, because it is as it is in that context, and the context is almost a part of it. And so that's why it can't apply across all sorts of different contexts, because the contexts make a difference to the way that the case is shaped and unfolds. And all of this kind of discussion where you're drawing things out of the literature, starting to say what they mean for your study, starting to respond to those ideas, comparing the voices with one another, is the sort of work that a really high quality methodology section would do. Okay, let's bring in here our final voice, Michael Quinn Patton, and he says that good case studies are holistic, context-sensitive, comprehensive, systematic, and layered. And that's quite perhaps a good way to draw together what's common across all of those voices around the table. It's a nice concluding statement because it picks up the idea of you've got to look at the whole case in a rounded sort of way, that you've got to relate it to its context, that you've got to be comprehensive in looking at the detail of what's unfolded and being systematic about that, and looking for different layers of meaning. What does a wink mean? What people have said meant? It draws it all together, doesn't it? So that might be a useful quotation to use in concluding a methodology section, because you could use it to pick up on all of the threads that you've discussed throughout, and that gives that section a kind of rounded closure, so you've got a clear arc of explanation that runs from the start to the finish of your methodology section. So you could then do that by saying whether what Patton says is congruent with what Yin said earlier about context and in what ways it was. And it's the stuff to do with context, isn't it? It's picking up that thread, which is a really important one in case study. And I'm conscious that this video is going on a little bit here, so you could stop the video at this point, read through what Stake is saying. I wonder whether... Well, let's quickly talk about it then. We've got this far, we're nearly at the end. So what Stake is saying is that triangulation is needed to avoid misrepresentation. This means using multiple sources of evidence and multiple viewpoints. You have to gather lots of data and challenge your explanations all the time. You need to keep checking on the repeatability of your findings. So again, this might inform your methodology and your methods somewhat. So he's saying you might find something out, but what you need to do is check it in some other way, if you possibly can, to see whether actually that is the truth. Is it a repeatable result? Does everybody involved agree that that's what happened? Does your questionnaire reflect what your interviews say, so that you're cross-referencing all the time? And that's what's meant by triangulation. It means looking at things from different points of view. So I always imagine it as a triangle drawn on the floor with the research subject in the middle of the triangle, and I'm going to stand on each of the 3 points of the triangle and look in on it. And of course, where you're standing alters what you see. It's a bit like walking around a sculpture. You see different things from different points of view, and that's what triangulation means. And that might inform the way that your major study unfolds, and you could talk about that in your methodology section. He also says that case studies gather people's subjective perceptions, and there's a danger that the findings are too subjective. So again, you need to look for replicability and falsification through triangulation. And this means comparing different participants' voices with one another to check the subjectivity of what somebody said. So one of the boys watching the fight might be a close friend of one of the participants. That's going to strongly colour his response to it and his reporting of it. And he might be telling a very different story from somebody who's a sworn enemy of the same boy. So important to try to look at different voices and compare them in your findings. Finally then, the key thing that I'm trying to emphasise throughout all of this is that you are at the party. And your thoughts, your responses to these voices need to be really apparent in what you write. And if you can use those voices to shed light on what you've done in the way that I've tried to illustrate here, and if you can compare and contrast those voices, looking for where they agree and where they disagree, it shows that you are responding thoughtfully to what they've said. So it's a way to be critically evaluative of the literature, and it will show in your writing that you are thinking deeply about what you've read, and that not only are you able to repeat what you've read, but that you're able to respond to it and use it in your approach to your research. So it's what we mean by critical evaluation, really, and that's a really important aspect of what you're trying to achieve in all of your writing, whether it's a methodology section or whether it's a literature review, which you will need to do for your major study. You could take a similar approach. So for those of you doing case study, I hope this has been helpful, but I also really strongly hope that it's helpful for others of you who are using a different methodology, because you can use the same sort of thing. So when you're reading through stuff on methodology, you come across something, it will spark something in your mind where you think, oh, that relates to what I'm doing in this way. And what we tend to do as a knee-jerk then is to write down the quotation. What we don't write down is the spark that went off in your mind, and that's really important. Why did you pick out that quotation? Try and write it down, because it turns it towards your study. And if you can then capture that spark and put it into your methodology section, it really strengthens it and makes a difference between a high-level piece of work and one that's just able to show familiarity with the literature.